Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Society's Queen, The Life of Edith, Marchioness of Londonderry, by Anne Decourcy. Narrated by Charlotte Strevens.
Chapter 1. Edith Chaplin always thought of herself as a child of the Highlands. She belonged, she felt, to the wildness and beauty of these remote and empty hills, their legends, songs and customs, to these people in whom a streak of Celtic mysticism coexisted alongside a hard-headed practicality. For almost 20 years after her marriage, she continued to think of Dunrobin Castle, where she had spent most of her childhood, as home. It was only when she began to live at Mount Stewart, the Londonderry estate in County Down, inherited by her husband when he succeeded to the marquisate, a place similarly touched by the imagery of past heroes, battles and Celtic lore, that her emotional centre of gravity shifted. On her mother's side, Edith's ancestry was romantic enough to cause any small girl to identify with it. Her mother, Lady Florence Lucen Gore, who died when Edith was only 4 years old, was a daughter of the 3rd Duke of Sutherland, the largest landowner in Britain, with estates in 5 counties that totalled almost 1,400,000 acres. 2 of the biggest were in Shropshire and Staffordshire, but for sheer size, they paled into insignificance beside his estate in Scotland, well over 1 million acres in the county of Sutherland, with a further 150,000 in Ross. His seat was Dunrobin Castle, perched above the sea on the remote and beautiful east coast. Gazing out of even its topmost window, Lady Florence, like some medieval northern princess, knew that everything she could see belonged to her father. In the people around, the clan tradition that combined pride and independence with a feudal sense of hierarchy still survived, despite the savage clearances of the 2nd Duke. Though both were from the landowning classes, Edith's parents could hardly have been more dissimilar in background and tradition. Henry Chaplin, though his mother was a Scot, was the archetypal English fox-hunting squire, robust, Tory, God-fearing, happiest out of doors and in the saddle. Indeed, for most of his long life, he was known as Squire Chaplin. Born on the 22nd of December 1840, he was the eldest of the 5 children of the Reverend Henry Chaplin, whose family had been Lincolnshire squires since 1658. His passion was sport, and in particular fox hunting, which he regarded as pleasure. Science, art and way of life rolled into one. When Edith's father was young, he hunted 6 days a week, and would often ride one of his thoroughbred hacks 40 miles to dinner and a ball after such a day. Nothing from social life and short sight to increasing weight, straitened means and ministerial duties was allowed to come between him and the sport he loved. As his girth increased, so did the size of his horses, mostly bought in Ireland to ensure good bone, and he would thunder down to the stiffest fences on one of these great 17-hand hunters. As a government minister, a special train would take him to where his stud, groom and horses waited near the meet. No man was a better judge of a horse or hound, and to the end of his life he would go anywhere in the country to look at a promising horse. He talked, wrote and thought horses, constantly, doodling them on his order papers when an MP and when he became a minister, leaving little sketches of them on the cabinet table. Though an absentee father, he was a tender and affectionate one. Edith was in many ways extremely like him. They shared the same vigour, high spirits and sheer joie de vivre, the same love of the outdoors, the same openness, generosity, and magnanimity of spirit that not only forgave, but was ready to admit fault. Both felt that money was their servant. But while Edith's tendency to extravagance was curbed by her anxiety not to displease the husband she adored, and found its outlet largely in the giving of presents, Henry ran through 3 fortunes. "All my life I have lived according to a very simple plan," he once remarked. "It is always to have what I like, when I like it, and as much of it as I like." It was a philosophy he followed faithfully. Perhaps the chief point Edith and her father had in common was the possession of a charismatic personality, what would later have been called star quality. Both exuded an aura of splendour, a magnificence. At Oxford, Henry's nickname was Magnifico, a feeling that life was to be enjoyed, an allure that appeared to men and women alike attracting, warming, even mesmerising. Henry's presence and manner made him as popular in drawing-rooms as in the hunting field. When Edith came into a room, said one contemporary, you were instantly aware that here was someone. Chaplin was but one of many Tory landlords who combined fox hunting with political duties. Yet by the time he married Lady Florence in 1876, he was a nationally known figure. His story was a romantic one, containing all the elements of drama designed to appeal to the Victorian imagination. Youth, beauty, love, a scandal that flew straight across the rigid moral and sexual codes of the day, betrayal, aristocratic misbehaviour, a magnificent sporting victory, and a morally satisfactory ending. If only for its effect on the youthful Edith, as she gradually learned the details of her father's past, it deserves to be told. As a young man, Chaplin was tall, broad-shouldered and handsome, energetic and healthy from the hours he spent in the fresh air every day, with bright chestnut hair, a clear complexion, and a firm jaw. His immaculate clothes were remarked upon in an age when dressing well was almost a profession, and he possessed a charming old-fashioned courtesy. When he encountered the Prince of Wales in the hunting field, he would sweep his cap off until it touched his horse's flank, and in drawing-rooms he would bow low over the hands of his hostesses. He liked only the best, in horses, hounds, food and wine, and admired only the most beautiful women. At 19, by now an orphan and in his second term at Christ Church, he inherited the estates of his uncle Sir Charles Chaplin, Squire of Blankney. As well as Blankney, Tathwell, and Metheringham, Temple Brewer and Little Caythorpe, he came into land at Hallington, Huffham, Maltby, Wraithby, and Scopwick, all in Lincolnshire and covering about 23,000 acres altogether. Smaller acreages in Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire were soon sold. Although he did not come into the rents from these until his majority, Henry Chaplin instantly began to live in the grand manner. At Oxford, he entertained, raced and hunted. He was also allowed to meet the Prince of Wales, almost exactly his own age, but then diffident and subdued from his repressive upbringing, whom he befriended and dazzled. They formed a lifelong friendship. It was in Chaplin's company that the Prince saw his first fox killed, for hunting, as always, was Chaplin's priority. He kept 4 hunters in Oxford itself, a remarkable number even in those days, and had the use of 18 others nearby. Finally, the Dean, tired of castigating him for appearing in chapel with his hunting kit, imperfectly hidden under his surplice, wrote to him, "My dear Mr. Chaplin, as far as I can gather, you seem to regard Christ Church as a hunting box." Not surprisingly, Chaplin went down soon afterwards and settled in earnest to the business of enjoying life. By the time he was 23, he had bought the Burton country from Lord Henry Bentinck and added it to the Blankney, hunting that enormous country 6 days a week with 4 packs of hounds, 2 of which he hunted himself. He drove his 4-in-hand to the races, stalked in Scotland in September, and entertained constantly and generously. He was a popular and generous landlord, dropping rents when times were hard, and in return expecting only good galloping and clean fences. One day, when hounds were held up by a wire edging a drive, he was furious to discover that the house had actually been built as a hunting box, and exclaimed, "There should be no wire anywhere about a hunting box, except on the champagne bottles, and that should be ready to come off at a moment's notice." When he came to London for the season of 1863, he quickly became aware of one of that year's debutantes. This was Lady Florence Paget, youngest daughter of the second Marquess of Anglesey. She was the sixth child of the Marquess's second wife, acclaimed by common consent as the most beautiful debutante for many years. The moment she appeared, she caused a sensation. Even the Queen, to whom she was presented at St. James's Palace, had remarked on her grace and carriage, the exquisiteness of her face and perfection of her tiny figure. She was as petite as she was beautiful, quickly ensured that she was known as the Pocket Venus. Almost at once she became, in the words of Queen magazine, the rage of the park, the ballroom, the opera, and the croquet lawn. She was much more than lovely, though. Warm, friendly, and sympathetic, her dove-like eyes were particularly admired. She was also excellent company. Although not rich, she had an unassailable position at the heart of aristocratic society. She was the granddaughter of old One-Leg, Wellington's cavalry commander, who, as Earl of Uxbridge, had had his right knee shattered in the Battle of Waterloo, undergone an amputation, and been created Marquess of Anglesey by the Prince Regent 5 days after the battle. All in all, she was one of the most desirable matches in the country. From Chaplin's point of view, everything about her, from her breeding to her finished perfection of appearance and manner, could have been designed to attract him. It was soon clear that 2 of her admirers had drawn ahead of the field. One was Chaplin, the other a mutual friend, the Marquess of Hastings. Harry Hastings, the 4th and last Marquess of Hastings, was a little younger than Chaplin. He was born in 1842, and a very different type. Slim, dark and sensitive-looking, one contemporary description gives him the sad brown eyes of a spaniel, with slender white hands, small feet, and exquisite clothes. He had a slight air of foppishness. He had had a chaotic childhood, a broken education, and by the age of 16 was an orphan. Insecure, pleasure-loving, emotionally deprived and weak-willed, he longed to be liked, and adored the flattery that seemed to promise this. His charm and gaiety, coupled with an underlying wistfulness of manner, gave him a little boy appeal, which his moods of petulance enhanced rather than destroyed. He and Chaplin had met at Christchurch. Hastings had been briefly at Eton, Chaplin at Harrow, where Hastings quickly became an inveterate gambler, betting, as far as the racecourse was concerned, in huge sums, and quite often apparently on anything that moved. When he won, he spent his winnings lavishly on the crowd of hangers-on that by now usually accompanied him. For where Chaplin, with his strong religious and high Tory background and close friendship with the Prince of Wales, was discreet in his choice of friends, Hastings was happy to entertain or be entertained by virtually anyone, offering the adulatory companionship he craved. With his interest in gambling and low-life, much of his time was spent at Limmer's, a hotel in Conduit Street, frequented by the racing fraternity. Here, after a night on the town, his favourite breakfast was mackerel fried in gin, caviar on devilled toast, and an hors d'oeuvre called fixed bayonets, all washed down with claret cup. All in all, he was as different from the solid, equable, confident Chaplin as could be imagined. Although Hastings was already a heavy drinker by the time he met Lady Florence, this had not yet affected his looks, and of the darker side of his life, the money-lenders, the disreputable racecourse associates, the rowdy and dissolute parties at dubious hotels like Long's or the Blue Post, she knew nothing. Florence was clearly torn. From the point of view of a Victorian mamma, Chaplin, rich, generous, even-tempered, good-natured and chivalrously protective, was the better match, whereas stories of Hastings' wildness, gambling and bad behaviour were already circulating. But Florence had not got a mother. Hers had died when she was only 2. Brought up by a father who adored her and older brothers who spoilt their enchanting small sister, she'd grown up accustomed to masculine worship, to having her own way, and to twisting men around her little finger. Besides, to any girl of spirit, confined in the iron corset of demure, missish behaviour deemed suitable for the Victorian young lady, Hastings' carefree recklessness, his aristocratic disregard for accepted standards, and his unmistakable partiality for herself alone, must have made him dangerously attractive. In addition, Chaplin still had not come up to scratch. By the end of 1863, at just 23, and still enjoying life as a bachelor, he went off big game hunting in India and appeared to leave the field to Hastings. But in May 1864, Chaplin returned to London again and quickly made up lost ground. By the end of the month, Lady Florence was watching the Derby with him from the royal box, at the invitation of his friend, the Prince of Wales. Few girls would have asked for more. Lord Hastings rallied strongly, naming one of his fillies after her. It was to make its debut at Ascot that year. Would she go with him? Yes, she would. Chaplin, cross and surprised that she preferred this to going in the royal party with him, was stung into the realization that conclusive action was needed. A fortnight later, at a ball given by the Marquess and Marchioness of Abercorn for the Prince and Princess of Wales, he asked her to marry him. She accepted at once, and the news was announced in the Times and Morning Post the next day, to a chorus of congratulations led by the Prince. The wedding was planned for August, 2 months ahead, and invitations were sent out straight away. Chaplin escorted his fiancée to balls and parties, to race meetings, and out driving in his cabriolet along the Ladies' Mile from Aspley House to Kensington, a tiger, smart in his yellow and black striped waistcoat, standing up behind. Hastings, who had plunged back into even heavier gambling and into his old East End haunts, had been one of the first to congratulate him. His lost, pathetic air had its effect. Chaplin, a man to whom any idea of suspecting dishonourable conduct was foreign, several times asked him to join them at the opera, theatre, or private parties. He may even have thought that Hastings' youth, he was still only 21, did not make him a serious contender for Florence's hand. After all, his rival had not taken the chance offered by his own 8-month absence. One Friday evening in July, just after they had returned from a visit to Blankney, where Florence had seen various improvements she had requested, all three went to Covent Garden, where Adelina Patti was appearing for the last time that season in Faust. Chaplin had suggested to Florence that Hastings might like to join them. Hastings, moody and preoccupied, sat on the other side of an equally silent Florence. The next morning, Saturday the 16th of July, Florence's wedding dress was delivered. She tried it on, calling her father to admire, then set off alone in his brougham at 10, giving the excuse for this unusual, solitary expedition that she needed to do some last-minute shopping for her trousseau. Arriving at Marshall and Snellgrove in Oxford Street, Florence entered by the side door and was met inside by either Hastings, his sister, or his closest friend, Freddie Granville. Contemporary accounts differ. After a few words, the two of them left through the rear entrance of the store, beside which a closed cab was waiting. They were driven the short distance down Bond Street to St. George's Church in Hanover Square, where a parson stood ready. By 12, Florence was married to Harry Hastings. Immediately afterwards, at Captain Granville's lodgings in St. James's Place, she sat down to write a long letter to Henry Chaplin. Before the ink was dry, she and her bridegroom left for King's Cross, where a special train had been ordered for them. At Loughborough, his 4-horse travelling carriage waited to take them to his seat. Florence's own family coachman waited outside Marshall and Snellgrove for 6 hours before returning home. It would be difficult to overestimate the size of the shockwave that ran through Victorian society. Lady Florence was castigated publicly for her unkind and immoral behaviour, privately for her stupidity in picking the wrong man. Hastings was universally condemned as a cad. Henry Chaplin, shattered not only by the loss of his bride-to-be, but by the dishonourable behaviour of the man he thought was a friend, turned for consolation to the sporting activities he loved, throwing himself into stalking, shooting and sporting tours. His friends rallied round. His sporting mentor and close friend, Lord Henry Bentinck, wrote, "All your friends, and you have many, look upon what has happened as a blessed deliverance." By the time Chaplin returned to London, months of fresh air, strenuous exercise and semi-solitude, with only the laconic companionship of stalker, gillie or sporting companion, had enabled him to conquer his distress and overcome any feelings of humiliation at such a public jilting. More to the point, he was no longer in love. Florence Hastings had soon realised her mistake. She sent Chaplin pathetic little notes on the miniature writing paper, with its blue or pink border and its disproportionately large monogram, which was the fashion in the 1860s, folded into 2-inch envelopes too small for the post. "You don't know how awfully happy you have made me by speaking to me today," ran the first. "It was so good and kind of you, and it is the first bit of sunshine I have had in my life for months." Alas, to Chaplin, the notes were so much paper. Though he remained fond of his former love, and frequently helped her with money, he had clearly put the whole episode and his feelings behind him. Indeed, much of the energy and passion he had formerly devoted to Florence and the plans for their life together was now focused on a new object: racing. It was said of him in the year following Florence's elopement that he began to buy horses as though he were drunk, and to back them as though he were mad. Many people thought he wanted to revenge himself on Hastings, whose ambition was to win the Derby, but this was not so. For one thing, neither vengefulness nor malice were in his nature. Racing was simply a new distraction, another way of expressing his passion for horses. Fortunately, the miserable ending of his love affair did not affect his excellent judgment of these animals. The feelings of the Marquess of Hastings for the man whose friendship he had betrayed had also undergone a change. A common human reaction of disliking, even fearing, those whom we have injured possessed him. With his tendency to extremes, he saw Chaplin as a rival still. Uneasily conscious that Chaplin was the better man and stood higher in public regard, Hastings longed not only to emulate, but to surpass him. He accepted the mastership of the Quorn, but hunted them so lazily and sloppily, sometimes only getting out of bed when the hounds had already arrived at the meet 10 miles away, that many of the field laughed at him. Now, in this latest sport, he was equally determined to outdo Chaplin. His feelings were given a sharper edge when his great friend, Captain Mashall, defected, as Hastings saw it, to join Chaplin as trainer. From then on, Hastings began to lay bets against Chaplin's horses whenever possible, often losing vast sums. By now, drink and the general dissipation of his life were taking their toll of his health, just as his uncontrolled gambling was depleting his fortune. On the 17th of June, 1865, Hastings and Chaplin both went to the famous Middle Park Stud at Eltham, where an annual yearling sale was held on the last day of the Ascot meeting. It was a fashionable and crowded event, where the best of the future crop of racehorses were paraded before wealthy and knowledgeable judges of horseflesh. Here, Chaplin, accompanied by his trainer, began to bid for lot 27, a handsome dark chestnut with a white blaze on his forehead. The colt, notable for his placid temperament and his small size, he stood fractionally over 15.2 hands, was by Newminster out of seclusion. Hastings, of course, instantly began to bid against Chaplin, running the price up until he finally left the colt to Chaplin at 1,000 guineas. On the way back to the coach, Chaplin and his party discussed what to call his new purchase. The name decided on was Hermit. It was quickly evident that Hermit was worth every penny of his enormous prize. His ability was apparent even as a yearling when, giving £35, he beat a promising filly over 4 furlongs, and when Vauban and Marksman, the horses he had beaten as a 2-year-old in 1866, came in first and third respectively in the 2,000 guineas the following year, Chaplin and his trainer, Captain Mashall, knew they had a potential Derby winner. For Chaplin, this meant more than glory. By now he was seriously embarrassed financially, and if Hermit won, the horse's stud fees would help to underwrite Chaplin's lavish way of life for another 15 or 20 years. Hastings, mad with jealousy and by now almost destroyed financially, bet against Hermit wherever he could, and stood to lose 120,000 if Hermit won. Of this, 20,000 was a bet with Chaplin himself. On Monday the 13th of May, 1867, 9 days before the Derby, when Hermit's jockey, Custance, was riding him during a serious pre-Derby trial, the horse suddenly gave a great cough. Blood poured from his nostrils and he almost fell. After such a hemorrhage, scratching seemed the only option, and Custance, then the top Derby jockey, was released to ride another mount. With the race only 9 days away, all seemed lost. But Mashall had discovered that the bleeding, though severe, came from a broken vein in the horse's nose, and not, as at first had been thought and feared, from his lungs. He went on working Hermit quietly, and always downhill. He took him to Epsom early, and on the Saturday before the Derby gave him 6 one-mile canters. If this had happened at Newmarket, word would have flashed round the racing world. He reported to Chaplin, who had also suffered injury. He was on crutches after a bad fall that had torn the cartilages of both knees, that he thought the horse had a chance. Derby Day dawned icy cold. Earlier dry weather had produced hard going. Flurries of snow fell at intervals, once while the horses were walking round the paddock before the big race. All of them looked miserable and tucked up, and Hermit, who even on a good day appeared listless at a slow pace, looked particularly wretched. To hide from the ring that he might still be a prospect, and to prevent the odds against him shortening, he was walked round without a rug, his coat staring from the cold, and his tail clenched down between his hind legs. It was only 20 minutes before the race that a jockey was found for him, a tall boy of 20 called Johnny Daly, only available because of his lack of experience. Hermit's starting price was 1,000 to 15, and there were no takers. It appeared hardly worth running him, but Chaplin knew better. Hermit had had a gallop over the Derby course the day before, and his head groom Bloss, who looked after Hermit and had slept in his box every night for 3 months before the race, told him, "He never went better in his life, sir, and squandered them all as usual. He wouldn't have blown out a candle at the finish, and what's more, I think he is certain to win the Derby after all." Years afterwards, Chaplin wrote that he had told his friends that if, when they came into sight again at the top of the hill, Hermit was in the first 3, where I had instructed my jockey to be, I thought he would certainly win. No one, of course, believed this, and they thought me a fool. When he ran into Hastings on his way to the stands, Chaplin warned him, "I think Hermit still has a chance, Harry. You can easily cover your bet with me by taking the odds which they are offering now." He himself waited until the horses were going down to the start, then called the man he employed to place bets and instructed him to take all the long odds he could get. It was in this atmosphere of tension that the race began. The snow cleared. Florence Hastings, pale-faced and listless in the furs that wrapped her against the chill, watched the horses of her husband and her former love go down to the post. There were 8 false starts, and when the off finally took place, the favourite, Vauban, leapt into the lead. But as they came round Tattenham Corner, on concrete hard ground, there was Hermit going like an express train. In the final furlong he passed the favourite as if the latter...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?